To say that things are getting more and more desperate with every episode of Ice Queendom is an understatement, and now, after episode 10, I think they've gotten so desperate that they've backed themselves too far into a corner. So much so that I think there's some leaps in logic that are going to need to be made to help them get out of it. But before we get into that, I will say spoiler warning for those who have not seen episode 10 of Ice Queendom. I won't be showing the episode or any clips from it in this video, simply images of the episode and analyzing the events that take place. I'll leave links in the description below so you guys can go to either Rooster Teeth First or Crunchyroll and watch this amazing series there. So the episode starts off by showing us Blake's reasoning and how the end of last episode came about, where Blake had this new form resembling Adam and was able to break a hole in the sky and start attacking Weiss and her army. While in the mansion last episode, Blake prevented Yang from acting too rashly and just charging back into the fight against Nightmare Weiss now that they had the relic. And Yang offhandedly mentioned about getting infected by the Nightmare and gaining the same immunity that Shion had. And this is what gives Blake her idea. She's thinking that she could get infected by the Nightmare that Shion was infected with, the one that Shion had captured and is keeping in that little jar, and once she's infected with it, she would become the negative version of herself, an equal to Weiss, and then they can face off within the dream. She points out that the Schnee Dust Company and the White Fang are mirrors of each other, that by bringing out the mirror opposite within Weiss's dream, this will bring forth memories within Weiss of the Faunus' persecution. They then can face off against one another, realize that they are friends and equals, essentially that they'll cancel out, and then they'll see that there's no reason for hate. And then after Weiss is saved from the Nightmare, then RWBY and Yang can go and save Blake from the Nightmare. This entire plan is filled with a few holes and gaps in logic, in my mind at least, and I would love to see your rationalization of it down in the comments below. Because throughout this conversation, there are a few things mentioned that just really don't make sense. Blake's entire basis for this plan was stating, you saw how freely Shion was able to move within the Nightmare. Well, because of his immunity. That nightmares don't attack other nightmares. And so Blake's entire logic with that is that they need a reason strong enough to force the nightmares to fight one another. They need a strong enough reason to fight so that they can defy another nightmare, which is just, in my mind, such a huge leap in logic because they are basing this off of Shion's immunity, that nightmares ignore one another, that nightmares do not see each other as enemies. And yet, Blake wants to infect herself with a nightmare, and by doing so, then have the two nightmares fight each other. Seemingly because her reason for fighting, her overall desire in the dream, will be enough to overwrite the nightmare's innate nature? That just doesn't make sense. What does make sense, though, and what actually happens that causes Weiss and Blake to fight, is that their consciousness is connected. Blake is currently within Weiss's dream when she is infected with the nightmare. And because she does accept the nightmare into herself, her dream reality starts to overwrite Weiss's. And because of that, the two nightmares clash. Each of their innate natures of wanting to corrupt the individual that they are infecting is overwriting each other's dreams, forcing the two infected individuals to clash. That makes sense. What Blake said doesn't at all. So the entire reasoning of Blake coming up with this plan just really doesn't have much basis to stand on, in my opinion, and they're taking some leaps in logic to put themselves into this situation. Not to mention, once Blake does this, there's going to be Weiss infected by the nightmare, Blake infected by the nightmare, and RWBY infected by the nightmare. They are backing themselves so far into a corner that the ways that they will be able to get out of this, it just doesn't seem likely or possible, so we'll have to see how it unfolds in the last 2 episodes. But for this entire plan to work, and to see if it's even possible, they first call Shion. Blake uses one of her coins, and Shion essentially says that it is possible, but it's going to be risky. If it doesn't quite work out, she could lose herself to the nightmare, and then both Weiss and her could die. And also the first thing Shion points out is, don't lose that relic that you found, because it's probably the last one. It's the last key to Weiss's heart. So, Yang's going to keep a good hold on that. While we are seeing the real world, though, we see that all of Team Juniper is still there watching. They want to be able to do something to help, but it's explicitly stated that Shion's semblance is kind of being pushed to its limit at the moment. There's already 4 people jumping into Weiss's dream. Shion's semblance can't handle any more than that. But it is proposed that switching out is an option if Shion deems it necessary. So I have a feeling that someone, most likely Jean, is going to swap out with someone else, likely Pyrrha, because we know that Pyrrha's alternate version is still within the dream and is just being dragged along without any explicit purpose. Most likely, it's so Pyrrha can enter the dream and, you know, she'll be able to unlock her dream powers because Weiss thinks of her so highly. It won't be Ren and Nora, because Ren and Nora's dream altars are already frozen and infected with the nightmare. That would just go very poorly, so it's going to be Pyrrha if there is any switching out that happens later on. Shion also asks Blake how many coins they have left, because the coins are their lifelines. They need to keep a couple left so that they can actually escape the nightmare at the end. And Blake says that there's 3 of them left. Blake has 1, and Yang has 2 coins. They don't know how much the others have, and we already know that Ruby and Jean don't have any coins left after last episode, so it's just these 3 coins. And Shion says that they must keep 2 of them in reserve. 1 to wake Blake up, because if the nightmare's hold is weak on Blake, then apparently a coin can still be used to wake her up, which we'll see later in that episode. I don't think that should be possible, but we'll see how things play out. And the last coin will then be able to be used to wake everyone else up. So essentially, they have 0 spare coins left, because Yang is going to use that 3rd remaining coin to create a door and get back to the kingdom, whereas Blake is just going to use her new dream abilities to get there. This is an extremely risky plan. Shion even says that if this doesn't work, there will be no way to save Weiss. So essentially, this is going to have to work for the plot of Ice Queendom, because we do know that Weiss survives at the end. And Ozpin does give his okay to go ahead with this plan. Both of them, Shion and Ozpin, have faith in Team RWBY, that they will be able to pull through. They have a strong will, and Ozpin even says that they are still hiding their true power within themselves. Which I don't really understand, because all of them have awakened their semblance. RWBY, sure, she has her silver eyes. Ozpin obviously knows what the silver-eyed warriors are, and RWBY is hiding some true power. I really hope that the silver eyes don't play a role in this entire show, but given how desperate of a situation they are by the end of this episode, I think there might be no other way out other than to have some Deus Ex Machina, the silver eyes, to do so. As for everyone else, what hidden power they could be hiding, Jean has his semblance and possibly some other capabilities, but between Weiss, Yang, and Blake, they really don't have any other secret capabilities that we've seen, even in the 8 volumes of RWBY we've had so far. Other than maybe Weiss and her summoning, but she's already capable of doing that within her dream, so I don't know exactly what Ozpin is referring to, other than maybe RWBY and Jean. This statement did confuse me a little bit, as did, a few other things in this episode, but they do go forward with the plan. Shion activates their weapon, and the string comes out, attaches to Blake's wrist, as well as the vial that the nightmare is in. And using Shion's string, they guide the nightmare up to Blake's arm, and it does infect her. Within the dream, Blake can see that the nightmare starts wrapping around her arm. She can see the vine markings appear, and tells Yang to run. Shion said that the nightmare would possess her immediately, and Yang needs to get away. So Yang starts taking off running out of the mansion, while everything starts to fall apart and shatter. The first thing we see as Blake becomes infected is a vision of Adam, the person representing her nightmare. And Adam asks her, can you really trust a member of the Schnee family? And do you regret betraying the White Fang? And Blake blatantly faces him and says that she doesn't regret anything, but Adam sees the darkness in her heart, disagrees, and the nightmare takes hold over Blake. As it does so, a hole appears in the floor beneath Blake, opening it to a black and crimson void. resembling how Blake's dream is beginning to overwrite Weiss's. Bashful Klein is transformed into a white wolf, with the 3 claw marks behind it resembling the symbol of the White Fang. And the entire mansion seems to be covered in crimson black flames. From the door to the mansion bursts forth a railroad as cracks continue to appear in the white landscape of the dream. And the Faunus burst forth, angry and vicious. Yang is still trying to flee from this, and as she looks back, she's obviously concerned about Blake. But in the doorway, cloaked in flame, is the visage of Blake, saying that she will bury the Schnee Dust Company. She has been taken over by the Nightmare and has become the Nightmare version of herself, resembling the insecurities that she holds within her heart, whether she made the wrong choice ditching the White Fang, something that she obviously doesn't regret later on in the series, but is something she might be unsure about right now, and hence why she's taking a similar appearance to Adam. Honestly, the visuals of this entire scene are fantastic, but regardless of how great it looks, Yang needs to run, as the cracks continue to appear around her and the Nightmare's thorns are bursting forth trying to attack her. She's able to dodge out of the way of some of them, but when they burst forth and almost surround her, they conveniently stop short, because lying right in front of where she was standing is Jean's cloak, which is another leap in logic for me. The cloak is just conveniently laying in front of Yang. That's really, really convenient, given that earlier in the episode, Blake had stated you saw how the Nightmare ignored Jean, which Jean lost his cape immediately upon entering the dream. So Jean himself still has this immunity, even though the cape also represents the immunity. So essentially, Jean himself is immune, but also has another object that represents the immunity, which kind of why? Other than the convenience of the plot, it doesn't really make sense. Jean himself being immune, I completely understand, because he was infected by the Nightmare wouldn't see him as a threat because he's just another Nightmare, and, you know, would ignore him, like we saw in the episode with the soldiers that were infected by the Nightmare. But him also having another object that represents his immunity kind of seems like just something for the convenience of the plot, which, you know, anime logic, but still I feel like this could be explained a little bit differently, or things could have played out a little bit differently so that it wasn't just so plot convenient. But either way, thanks to this cloak, Yang is able to get away. She runs back to the initial sign that we always see whenever anyone enters Weiss's dreams. And next to the sign is Bumblebee. Yang then uses one of her coins to create a door and get back to the train, just like we saw in last episode. Now, I do want to point out, Bumblebee was probably created by Yang using her first coin when she got to the dream, right? Because Weiss has never seen Bumblebee, and Yang's bike should not exist within Weiss's dream in any capacity unless it's because of Shion's markers. So, you know, it's also a bit of a leap in logic that Bumblebee still exists within the dream. Because we've seen earlier that other things created by Shion's coins, like the map that RWBY first created when she got to the dream, disappeared immediately even though she didn't want it to. So I'm curious to understand how some objects seem to be permanent within the dream, like Yang's bike and the doors, and yet others, like a chalkboard map that RWBY would create, are just not. I guess that the map would constantly be updating and it's only meant to be temporary, and same with the phone booths and everything, but it's still an inconsistency that does stand out to me. And now we catch up to exactly where we left off in last episode, with the hole in the sky opening up as Blake's dream, her nightmare, is overriding Weiss's, allowing the White Fang and Blake to attack Weiss and her soldiers. And the clash between Weiss and Blake does have some very nice visuals to it. Unfortunately, we don't really see much of the fight happen on screen, and I really hope we get to see more of it in the next episode, and as well in episode 12, the, massive clash that's probably going to happen against the Nightmare. At this point in time, Yang appears through the door inside the train and then bursts out of the train to get to her sister and give Ruby the relic. The plan currently is to have Blake take care of Weiss and distract her. Yang will take care of Big Nicholas and distract it so Ruby can get to the tower, get to the nightmare, and free Weiss. So Yang hands Ruby the relic. And when she did so, all I could think is, really? You know what happened the last 2 times that Ruby had the relic? She dropped them both. And so, I don't know if Ruby's really the most trustworthy one to have the relic. And as if by prophecy, the moment that Yang is able to get Ruby to the tower, and Yang goes off to distract Big Nicholas, Ruby enters the tower, and Whitley swoops in, immediately snatching the relic from her. Like, Ruby really isn't that great at holding on to these things. But to her credit, she does immediately pull out her Crescent Rose and shoot Whitley down, putting a hole in his wing, and I don't think she killed him, but definitely injured him to the point where he probably can't fly anymore, and she's immediately able to get the relic back. Also notable to point out that because Yang burst out of the train and took the door off of the train by doing so, she left Jean, Pyrrha, and the Tiny Weisses vulnerable, which the Armagigas takes complete advantage of. And yeah, that was kind of inconvenient. You know, Yang could have moved a couple train cars down, gotten out of a door there, and maybe kept the protection for the Tiny Weisses, Jean and Pyrrha. But now everyone is part of the battle against Weiss's army. The Tiny Weisses go into attack mode again and start attacking the Armagigas, which they seem to be able to handle fairly well, all things considered. And Jean is getting a bit overwhelmed. He falls over yet again, but stumbles upon the sword that the Armagigas had tossed away previously. I still think that this sword is going to be used by Pyrrha, if Pyrrha is able to switch out with Jean, if Jean gets in trouble or something like that, though I don't really know if a coin is going to be needed to be able to make a switch, because a coin is needed to wake someone up, but switching might be another convenient way to avoid having to use a coin. It would probably still drain Shion's aura more. I'm curious how things are going to play out with that, but as far as we know, Jean can't actually pick up this sword to use it in a, well, reasonable way in battle, so we're going to have to see how it plays out there. Also, one other thing I want to point out, when Ruby shot Whitley out of the sky, she then turns and looks at her weapon and wonders if that's how Weiss intended for it to be used. Which, I mean, is how Ruby intended it to be used as well, just with the gun pointing on the other side. If this is the entire explanation that they give for why Ruby's weapon is reversed, that's just a little confusing to me, because that's also not an explanation for why it's a snowboard. If there's going to be an explanation for why it's backwards, like, there's a few things that seem to be very confusing about this episode in particular. At the same time, we see Yang distracting Big Nicholas, dodging out of the way of the fists that are raining down on her, and it also seems that Yang can defy gravity, as she rides her bumblebee on the side of a building. She notes, only in a dream, but there's been no previous example of this, that any of the people who have entered the dream have any such abilities to defy gravity and things like that. I'm gonna say that this is probably because Weiss's dream is weakening due to the influence of Blake's dream overriding it. Maybe as a possible explanation, but I still don't really see how this is possible. And then, as Big Nicholas goes to sweep at Yang, she punches the arm and sends it flying backwards, and we can see that she was able to damage it. Again, I think it's because Weiss's dream is weakening that Yang is able to do more damage against the things created from Weiss's mind. That makes sense. The defying gravity part, not so much. Again, let me know your rationale for some of this in the comments down below, because things aren't exactly making that much sense overall. And then we cut back over to the fight between Blake and Weiss. Weiss is confused as to why Blake is dressed that way, thinking that she's not acting like herself, that the Blake she knows would never say something like, "As a daughter of the Schnee family, you will pay," because Blake seems to hate every single member of the Schnee family. All of them are enemies, whereas Weiss is actually saying, like Nightmare Weiss is actually saying, that she doesn't hate all Faunus. Blake had actually mentioned earlier in the episode that the mansion where the Faunus were locked away was a place where things that Weiss didn't really understand or couldn't make sense of were put. Not that she was actually ignoring them, just that she was putting all of the things she didn't understand in one place, which kind of seems like she's ignoring them, just pushing them to the side so she doesn't have to look at them. But now she's confronted with this reality, and it really seems like Blake's conviction is stronger than Weiss's, because Weiss is stating that she doesn't actually hate all Faunus, whereas Blake seems very intent on hating all Schnees. So I have a feeling Blake's nightmare might actually overpower Weiss's. Because of the, discrimination she's experienced throughout her entire life, the insecurities might be stronger. Again, it's really comparing like apples to oranges, but it seems like Blake is going to overpower Weiss, and hopefully we'll find out in a fight that takes place next episode. While this is happening though, Shion seems to be struggling a little bit in the real world. The nightmare is infecting Blake at a rapid rate because she intentionally accepted it into herself. And because of this, Pyrrha logically points out, won't that just make it more difficult to save her? And Shion's response is, well, because she accepted it intentionally, her heart may be able to hold out its resistance to it. That doesn't make sense in any way, shape, or form. Blake accepted the nightmare into herself, and obviously, to do so, she showed no resistance. Her heart did not resist the nightmare. And because she did that, it should be able to hold out its resistance longer? That logic just does not hold. And it really confused me when Shion said that. It also seems that as the nightmare was infecting Blake, you can see it creeping up her arms. Shion is wrapping their string around Blake's arms. So does Shion's string also have the capability to hold back the nightmare in some way? It really shouldn't, given that Shion's semblance is just the ability to jump into dreams. This string is something extra, so, things are making less and less sense given this episode. But Shion's rationale there that Blake's heart should hold out its resistance because it wasn't resisting the nightmare just doesn't make sense. When you let the nightmare take control of your heart, it's gonna control you a lot more quickly. It doesn't mean you can break the control easier than anyone else. But then we get the final scene of the episode, where RWBY is going to face the nightmare. She enters the cathedral area using the relic, and then puts the relic into her pouch. That same pouch that the first relic, the red one, fell out of when she was knocked back. So hopefully this time around she actually remembers to zip the damn thing up so the relic won't fall out and she loses it again. I don't trust RWBY with any of these relics. She then enters the theater, and the clash against the nightmare is foreshadowed for next episode, as RWBY is jumping and the nightmare's thorns are coming at her. And given this image, I doubt RWBY, with the skill that she has currently, is going to be able to defeat it. I know that the previous times when RWBY, Blake, and Yang went to attack the nightmare, it was Nightmare Weiss that stopped them, not the nightmare itself, but this is a pretty large Grimm, and although RWBY is a skilled fighter, she's still very much a first-year student at Beacon Academy, and this Grimm has grown quite large and powerful due to feeding off of Weiss's aura for so long. I think it's going to overpower RWBY, and the only way that I can see her getting out of this would be her Silver Eyes, but as I explained in a different video already, she shouldn't have the Silver Eyes power within the dream because Weiss just has no knowledge of the Silver Eyes, nor does anyone else in the dream. So, this is where the episode ends, and the logic presented in this episode kind of doesn't fit that well. A lot of things seem to be falling apart. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I think they've pushed themselves too far into a corner. Because now, Weiss is infected by the nightmare, Blake is infected by the nightmare, and they explicitly reminded us when RWBY picked up her weapon to go attack the nightmare that the thorns are still on her hand, though they're just the small swirl on the palm of her hand. We saw that they had, covered the entirety of her hand before, so it seems the nightmare has receded in some way, shape, or form. Still, 3 people are infected by the nightmare. If RWBY is able to defeat this nightmare in a one-on-one battle, then Blake's nightmare, her dream, should just overtake the entire dream world, because there's nothing to conflict against it. And then they'll have to go fight Blake's nightmare. But since she did not resist, and it's already been stated that the nightmare is growing rapidly, it absolutely should not be possible that, oh, they can just use a single coin to wake Blake up from this nightmare. That would just kind of defeat the entire purpose and take away, like, the entire tension of the situation. What Blake is doing is meant to be risky, and if a single coin can just solve it afterwards, like, I don't know. I'm curious to see how they're going to be able to wrap everything up in the last 2 episodes, but there is a lot of things that really don't make sense given what happened in this episode. I like the idea of Blake infecting herself with a nightmare and that causing the 2 dreams to clash with one another, and thus leading to Weiss and Blake clashing with one another. Luckily and conveniently, because their inner insecurities are opposites to one another, Weiss is afraid of the Faunus, and Blake hates the Schnees, which leads them to clash. But it was mentioned as well that the Schneedust Company and the White Fang are mirror opposites of one another, which isn't exactly the case. Yes, the Schneedust Company has obviously oppressed the Faunus, and the White Fang's main goal is to free the Faunus from oppression, but the Schneedust Company's main goal has nothing to do with Faunus. They just want to make money. That's all Jacques wants to do. He just wants to create a monopoly on the dust industry and to make loads and loads of money spreading the name of Schnee around the world. He doesn't really care if he uses Faunus and humans to do that. It's just Faunus with the oppression that's seen within the world are the easiest way to go about it. So I wouldn't say that those 2 goals are polar opposites to one another, that they reflect one another perfectly, but when it comes to Weiss and Blake's insecurities, that does. So, you know, things don't exactly make sense with what has been stated in this episode, and, you know, I still like Ice Queendom as a whole for all of the ideas that they've presented, and I'm really curious to see where the last 2 episodes are going to take us, but this one has set it on a path where things really don't make sense. Given that Shion's aura is very depleted, Shion really shouldn't be able to help that much at all within the dream. They have 2 coins left, supposedly, one to wake up Blake individually, and one to wake up everyone else. But Blake being so infected by the nightmare, I doubt that that should be able to work. And once they free Weiss from the nightmare, they need to deal with Blake's nightmare within the next 2 episodes, and there's also the nightmare infecting RWBY. Now, I guess maybe they're going to go the route that if RWBY is able to defeat this nightmare, the one that did infect RWBY in the first place, then maybe her nightmare will disappear as well since she was infected with it within the dream or something like that. But again, leaps in logic that I really hope the finale of Ice Queendom and the last 2 episodes can make sense of all of this, but it seems like it's heading in a direction where things are going to have to be Deus Ex Machina'd out of this, using the Silver Eyes or Jean awakening some power or some other way, because things are extremely dire right now, and I don't really see a way for them to get out of it as it stands. But let me know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. I know I was a little bit more critical of this episode, and I'd love to know what you think on it. Of the things that were said and what I'm considering leaps in logic, how some things don't make sense with what's been established previously, and also how you think things are going to unfold in the next 2 episodes. Let me know down in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed this video, want to see more like it, more coverage of Ice Queendom, I still have a number of videos planned, as well as Volume 9 coverage to come, and more theory videos on that. Make sure to subscribe and join the Guild of the Eternal Flame. Tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.